independent spaces, what does it mean, right? And I am glad that we are here to talk about it in an independent space, well, independent enough, hopefully, and we will discuss what exactly that means. So welcome to episode 64 of Teh Tarik with Walid, and the second one that we are doing Teh Tarik with Walid in real life. So I am delighted to have two very special guests today, two legends, you can say, in this space, right? And the first is Mr. Fong Hoe Fang. I don't know how many of you know this. I mean, the ones here obviously know, but he was the founder of Ethos Books, and think about how much good that publication has done to Singapore, right? So without him, you wouldn't have had all of that discourses, those books, and so on. And he is also the co-founder of Dakota Dreams, who's hosting us today, and hopefully not for the last time. Hopefully you'll host Teh Tarik with Walid more. And we have Mr. Prashant Somosundaram, and he will introduce himself later, right? Just now I asked him, what should I say about you? Then he rattled off a list of achievements. He didn't, but he should have, right? And we will be talking about this, about independent spaces and what exactly it means. But before we do that, I just wanted to, it's a shout out for two members of parliament who are currently unwell, Mr. Faisal Manap and Mr. Lam Eng Hua. So one has been diagnosed with a heart attack, was sent to the ICU. The other has recently been diagnosed with cancer. And I think whichever side of the political aisle you are on, you never want this to happen to your worst enemy. So hopefully they get well soon, both of them. All right. So the first thing is, right, so what exactly, I wanted to ask, both of you can answer this. What is an independent space? And is there such a thing in Singapore, right? In Singapore, you have POFMA, you have FICA, you have police permits, you have the Newspaper Licensing Act, you have all of these things. So what exactly does an independent space mean in Singapore?
Well, to me, it is a physical space, first of all. It must be a physical space, because if it is a psychological space, then we have lots of that. Our thoughts are free, right? So we can go anywhere with that. But it must be a physical space, in my view. And secondly, it must be a space where we feel safe. It's a safe space for us to discuss any topics under the sun. Yeah, to me, that's an independent space.
Is there such a space in Singapore where we feel the liberty to discuss, we feel we have the liberty to discuss any?
Yes, we have that. The coffee shops where people talk, where men drink beer and rant against the government. That happens very often. I think what you may be referring to or trying to get at would be a space big enough to accommodate a fairly large audience. A place like perhaps Hong Lim Park, where there's a lot more people can come in, and not just a table of 5 or 10 sitting there ranting away. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Yeah, I mean, for me, besides it being a physical space, there are a lot of independent physical spaces that exist, but I think the state of mind is also quite important. A lot of people don't really exercise the independence of their spaces as much as we would like them to, because, you know, they benefit from the status quo that exists. So for me, a lot of it with independent space is how much we want to create a space that's conducive to counterculture, to create spaces that's accessible for people who may not be able to unlock these kind of spaces in other parts of Singapore. I think that, to me, is the interesting part of creating an independent space in Singapore. I mean, knowing how, you know, rents can be so expensive, we know that a lot of people may not be able to have access to public or private spaces in order to experiment and push certain boundaries that they want. And for me, it's about creating that kind of space where we're never really independent. You know, even for Projector, we're licensed by the government. We're constantly aware that, you know, we have to apply for all these kind of licenses to do whatever we need to do. But I think where we practice our independence is to try and push these boundaries and not be fearful of people who are doing things within the legal limits. I mean, one example is like, anti-death penalty kind of talks, which a lot of other independent spaces may shy away from. For us, it's as long as it's within, the legal guidelines that we have for indoor spaces and all, we're willing to push that boundary and create that space for dialogue.
So the space must be both physical and psychological. Right. Okay. So based on what you just said, right? When you said that maybe some people do not think they are as free as they should be, or they are not thinking as freely as they should be, do you think sometimes people who operate in independent spaces, they have this view of the laity, the layman, the lay Singaporean, and it's perhaps a condescending view, right? Where how is that different? Not that I disagree with you, I'm pushing you a little. How is that different from the government saying, oh, you don't know what's good for you, right? We know, right? You are also saying the same thing from a different place, right?
I wouldn't say that I treat it differently. I mean, for us, we create that space, but we don't speak for people. Generally, we do find stakeholders within the communities to then take up that space and speak for themselves. So the same thing with like, I mean, we've done, talks on homeless issues and all that, but we don't do the talking. We create the space, we make it accessible for them through some way. I mean, we don't do sponsorships. We always find a way to make it sustainable because we have overheads and all that we need to cover. But we do find people and stakeholders from that community to be there. So we are more of a platform for what you would term as a layperson. But, for us, they are all, community stakeholders, and whatever issues that we want to platform, we find people within the community to speak for themselves.
So why is it important, Mr. Fong? You've started two already, right? Why the need for an independent space?
I think that's important because, like Prashant says, for alternative narratives to come out to show what the other parts of Singapore, what the other Singaporeans in Singapore are thinking, and these are people without easy access to a voice. Right, to a platform, and so therefore, by having a space there, an independent space where the person who allows that platform will not self-censor, will not prejudge as to what is happening. One example, okay? For example, if somebody comes and says they want to run a workshop on how to make a bomb, will we allow it? I would allow it, actually. Yeah, I would allow it because that is it's something that that works, right?
How to edit this part out?
Yeah, I mean, you learn how to make a bomb in the army. I learned how to do it when I was in NS. So what's wrong with that, right? But I think the concern is that what are the people who are attending that particular talk going to do with that knowledge, right? And that is something that we cannot control, because if the space is there, or they can learn it on internet, they can learn it anywhere, we must learn to deal with that, rather than to just censor everything off. I don't know, that's my view, my personal view.
So I get the, maybe let's move away from that example, which is not endorsed by Teh Tarik. But let's not use that example, but I get what you're saying. So even we must give space to even the most abhorrent of ideas, right? And then we debate it, and a person, and I do agree with you as well, right? Ultimately, when a person does something, it is on that person, right? Like, if that person read somebody else or whatever it is. I mean, if that person read 100 books and one of them happened to be Karl Marx, you cannot possibly blame Marx for that. That's what you're saying, right? Yeah, okay, yeah. And do you agree with it? Like, all ideas, like, even the most abhorrent of ideas should be platformed.
I think for me, I'll probably draw certain boundaries. Yeah. I mean, for us also, we try and strike a balance. We are a commercial entity. I have, 35 mouths to feed. So it's really quite important for me to strike that balance in figuring out what we allow within our space. And if we do find, and I mean, to be frank, we've had instances where people whose views we don't agree with wanted to rent our space, which, we decided that we didn't want to do it because, they have other avenues that they can access this space. And we are not comfortable platforming these opinions and this community in that sense. So, yeah, I mean, while we are independent in that sense, we do have opinions and we are subjective in that sense. And so we do have a discussion within the team to see, whether we are comfortable platforming these kind of opinions which we don't agree with, and where do we draw the line.
So where do you draw the line?
I mean, for that particular instance, we decided not to. And it's largely by looking at which other communities may be impacted by these opinions. And if somebody else, and particularly a marginalized community, is going to be hurt, or, it kind of victimizes vulnerable communities, it's not something that we're comfortable doing. And that's why we then said, even if it's a private venue hire, we're not comfortable with this taking place in our space.
Okay, thank you. I hope there's time to explore that a little bit further, but I wanna move on back to the topic. So you guys, I don't know, the audience maybe half may understand the next point that I'm talking about. So I think the two of you have watched Yes Minister, or at least have heard of it before. Maybe the younger ones have not seen. And there is this one scene. So it's a British comedy series about a civil servant and a minister who became prime minister. There's this one scene where the civil servant who represents the upper tier of a society, whereas the minister actually comes from a more humble background. And the civil servant was saying that you must always allow the arts to flourish, right? Arts and the music, this is really for high society. And whereas the other person was saying, the minister was saying, no, this is for a very privileged group, a very elite and elitist group, right? So, and this question is really for Prashant, right? Why is art important? Do you think that art is the domain of the privileged?
I think it's quite hard to generalize art as, privilege. I mean, the different tiers, obviously, for arts. And I mean, there's community arts programs. There's a lot of people who are not artists, but are involved in the arts. And I do find there's a lot of value for arts as an expression that I find people, and I mean, it's also sometimes when you go to a museum and you're like, wow, like this also can, I mean, how does that become art? So, no, so I mean, it's really a mindset in terms of, for me, art is a way of unlocking a critical engagement with certain issues, particularly with film in our case, and with performance art. It allows us to then have dialogues after that, or engagement with it. I really don't think it's the high-end contemporary art. I mean, that exists, but it's not in a space that we engage in. So that's a art gallery, the kind you find in Gilman and all that. But I mean, for us, it's a lot more of community engagement kind of projects. And I do find a lot of value in that. I mean, actually, a lot of my experience starting in the arts in Singapore was through Migrant Voices. It was when I came back from studies in 2004, around then, I participated in a Necessary Stage Fringe Festival program, working with migrant workers. So I helped with the Tamil translations for migrant workers who actually formed their own bands and all, and they would jam on, every Sunday on their days off. And through that, then a group of us started this organization called Migrant Voices that engaged in, forum theater projects with migrant workers, and then we staged it in public spaces and all that. And I mean, it's interesting, then where you bring arts into a communal space or a liminal space kind of environment, people then feel that they can engage with it better rather than if it's in a gallery or something like that. And people were then participating in these theatre performance pieces. The public, regular members of public would then step up and take up space within these performances. And there was interesting conversations that were unlocked from these kind of forum theatre projects and all that. So I think, sorry, I went on a rant, but yeah, but I do think that there's a lot of value in arts as a form of expression and engagement for different tiers of society.
Mr. Fong, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I remember reading or seeing this report in the papers about a violinist, Joshua Bell. He's one of the most accomplished violinists in the world, right? He spent about, half an hour, 20 minutes at a subway in America playing one of the most intricate pieces on his violin, which was worth $32 million, right? And during the time he played, people were just walking past him and thought he was just not hustler, a busker, you know? He collected $32, right? In the period of time. So does it mean that the average man doesn't appreciate that kind of art, that kind of music? No, because when they dug deeper, they found that people have no time. When you have no time, you won't listen, you just walk past. You need to have time in order to enjoy music, right? And in the same way, I think, art is never the privilege, or rather, it has been made so, the privilege of the elite. It has been made so. I also know another artist, a friend, who went to prison, and she spoke to women prisoners and got them to do a quilt, made a quilt that represented their feelings, you know. And I think subsequently these quilts were exhibited, and people enjoyed them. Exhibited what that, I think, if I'm not wrong, right? And people enjoyed them. So, I mean, art is, Prashant has it, you know, it can be enjoyed at different levels, right? But it has been made, a domain of the elite, because these are the people with money, these are the people with power. And so, I mean, the guys Joshua Bell, when he played that, what happened was that the night before, just the night before, he played to a sold-out audience of people who paid $100 just to listen to him play that piece, same piece. And here he collected $32. Yeah. So,
Okay. Thank you.
So, yeah, and just to add on that, it also goes to how we value art, right? I mean, if you see an art in a void deck, you think, okay, whereas you see it in a gallery framed within certain things, there's a different value to it. So sometimes, I mean, we also as patrons or what, can be at fault in a way in terms of how we value and perceive art in a way.
Okay. Thank you so much. So can the two of you briefly share your own experiences in starting independent spaces?
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I guess I touched on it a bit already, but yeah, so it started out actually a lot with Migrant Voices, which was a arts charity that we started, and it was always a challenge to find spaces, whether it was to run workshops every Sunday or whether it was to stage performances and for the migrant workers. So it was then where I was like, in Singapore we need to find, and I had been in the States for a while, for 4 years, doing my undergrad on a government scholarship. So I also needed, so I was a military officer for 6 years after my studies, but I really needed a creative outlet. And so that's how Migrant Voices, I got involved in Migrant Voices. So the moment I left the Air Force, I felt that my calling, in a way, was to create these kind of spaces. I had a certain level of salaries in my 6 years, and I had that money that I wanted to invest into creating a space. And so that's why I started up this space called Artistry in Arab Street area, So this was a cafe by day, and at night we would carry all the tables out and create space for experimental music or performances and all that. So going back to how rents are so expensive in Singapore, it was difficult to have a large space enough to run a cafe and a performance space, but we, did a night and day kind of approach. And that's how I started getting involved in a lot of creative communities in Singapore. So there are a lot of creative people in Singapore. They just don't have spaces to experiment and perform and access. And a lot of it, I mean, even now, like for the spaces that I run, I have to be so conscious about noise issues and all that. Because there are residents nearby, we get shut down, everybody suffers and all that. So it's always trying to manage this balance, and that's something that I learned in artistry, where we were neighboring undertakers, but also neighboring hotels and all that. So trying to figure out how to push boundaries without pissing off your neighbors, and also creating space without burning your bridges and such. So that happened, and then at that point, Projector, which was already... So Projector started up in 2014. I wasn't part of the founding team, but I was part of the Kickstarter project. So the way Projector started was the founders, they found a disused cinema space in Beach Road, which was a 1970s cinema that was the largest single screen at that point, but it had since been converted into 3-screen kind of space. It's been partitioned, but it was disused for a long time. And they have found this space and felt that there was a need for an independent cinema in Singapore. So they then ran a Kickstarter project, which was actually, on hindsight, a great thing, because it generated a lot of publicity and community investment in the project without even starting up yet. So there was a lot of buzz. People were excited about it. They donated $120 to have their names emblazoned on the seats and all that. So there's a lot of excitement. So by the time it launched in 2014, it had strong community support, and people were quite excited for this to exist in Singapore. It almost was like, for the content that was showing, like Operation Spectra, am I getting that right? There was a documentary on Cold Store, I think. Now I forget. But people would come and they would feel like, they're doing something that is illegal in Singapore because it offered the kind of environment, but actually it was all fully legal. But it's just that nobody was willing to do these things at that point in time. So at that time, then Projector approached me to, having seen the kind of live performance stuff that I was doing at Artistry, was interested in trying to also expand beyond film and do so. Then I took over the operations in Projector 2 years after they started. And then long story short, we merged into a single entity, and now I run the full space. So that's brought us here.
Thank you. Mr. Fong?
Prashant has done a wonderful job. I remember using his space for our parties and talks and so on, all free. We just had to buy a drink or something, and he was so generous, because of that, the ethos flourished. Yeah, we will buy more drinks. Yeah, but anyway, coming back to this thing, I think a space is very important. A physical space for people to bond, to discuss, and look, even Lee Kuan Yew needed a basement in Oxley Road, right, to start off the PAP, right? And that was how the PAP started. And I remember many times, if those of us who have done NS and so on, if you have been through with a group of fellow recruits or whatever it is, and you live through those 3 months or whatever that you were with them, in the same physical space, right, in the same physical space, despite all the hardship, I'm pretty sure some of the recruits still come together. In my experience, I was the 6th batch of NS guys. My batch of recruits, those guys I went through recruit with and so on, until today, we meet every year. We have watched each other's kids grow up over the last 40 years. every year without fail, we meet on the second day of Chinese New Year. Of course, not everybody makes it, but there's a big enough group. And that came about because of that physical space that we share. Physical and mental space, that we went through this hardship together, we went through this thing together. And I'm sure many of the NS guys who have done NS would share the same thing. Your good buddies are your fellow recruits, right? And so because of that, we felt that the space was necessary. But unfortunately, we could not afford to, because we were also a commercial enterprise, and the commercial enterprise was there to sort of make money, to feed mouths, and unlike Prashant, I was a bit more frightened. I said I got to make the money first and then try and do this thing. Yeah, so we rented, but we allow our space to be used for talks, for discussions, or whatever is necessary. But so then, as we sort of over the last after 20, 30 years, we were stable enough, right, to be able to even rent a space. There was a space called Agora sometime back, where a friend who also shared these ideas, he rented the space, and we tried to support it by allowing that space for civil society members, for people who might be interested to discuss it, to come together and to discuss it free. Yeah, they have to provide their own coffee, unfortunately. Yeah, right. So we did it way, but all this has led me to the conclusion that actually we need a space that is owned by civil society. Right. Think of the Huiguans, the Chinese clan associations. A lot of them are dead and gone now, as in we never hear of them, right? Except for the Hokkien ones that own Ngee City and so on. But there are still pockets of them. And why do they still exist? Because they own property. They bought property in the early days, and they use it as a space for discussion, for helping their fellow clansmen, and that developed into something that has stayed even today, right? But of course, apart from the hardware, you also need the hardware, and this is where civil society has to make it work. Yeah. So I would say we need to own a space. Yeah.
Online communities cannot replace physical communities, right? Okay. So thank you. So a reminder that you can type in your questions, and anyone from the audience as well can just share your comments or thoughts. Just a shout out to two people. Sorry, this will always happen. Our two famous guests of Teh Tarik, Walid Sarah and Sudhir, who recently joined the exclusive but ever-expanding club of people who have been POFMAT. Well, his publication has been POFMAT. So thank you for making it. And I wanted to turn up the temperature a little. Okay, so so I would say, I think a lot of people would say, and I would concur with this as well, that civil society in Singapore has largely been co-opted. Yoyan is not here, right? So aware, maybe you can say aware has been co-opted. Pink Dot to some extent has been co-opted, and some activists, right? They enjoy the patronage of the state. Right? They enjoy getting invited to these events and so on. And there is something about that does it does something to you, the being in the circles, the halls of power and influence. Even if you may not have actual power, right? But being around that, it does something to you spiritually, emotionally, I think. Right? So, would you guys agree with that? That civil society in Singapore has largely been co-opted? Of course, there are the Joe medias which has not been and will not be co-opted. There's the Alfians and there's the Kirstens but those are few and far between. The fact that I can rattle them off, and it's not even a long list, maybe, is that true? Civil society has been co-opted to the point that it is toothless?
Well, I mean, it depends. The names you mentioned, Afian, Kirsten, and so on, these are individuals. These are individuals. And as individuals, the responsibilities are a little different from if you run an organization, right? Because when you run an organization, you have to be aware that there are 35 mouths to feed, or there are other people to take care of, right? And I believe in any country, things are not about always getting your own way. It cannot be that way, because then you'll be at one extreme. Things are about, to some extent, about compromise, right? Some things you can come together and discuss and compromise. Some things you can't. So it's up to that organization to depend on. I'll give you an example. Ethos Books. When we first started out, we did not take state funding for some of our books, right? Then along the way, somebody came and convinced me that we should take state funding to promote books. And then you look at it and you say, yeah, why not? But you must remember, you do that, I take state funding, Ethos takes state funding only for books, or makes an application for state funding, only for books which we know fall outside the narrative. Fall within the narrative. Or at least, if not within the narrative, I mean, sometimes you can be outside the narrative, but as long as it's not too sensitive, like ROMs, yeah. But, yeah. But anyway, you as long as you do that, yeah, that is a compromise, but it is not corruption, because you must still remember that at the end, you still have to pursue the end objective, which is about truth, integrity in certain things, right? But you recognize that you may have to give way in other areas. It's not a type of war, isn't it? I don't know. I used to do it myself. I used to take part in the type of war, but I wasn't the guy pulling. I was the guy who was instructing people how to pull. So, and you remember, there are times when you must hold rather than pull. There are times you must hold rather than pull. Only then can you win. You know? It's not always the strongest guy wins. There's strategy involved, right? Sometimes you must give you a little bit and hold, and then you pull, right? So, and this is the same in society, I feel, yeah.
Okay. So compromise is not co-optation. Right?
Yes, and I mean, actually, just to echo that, beyond just strategy, there's or to borrow an Ethos title, it's the art of advocacy, which is really quite important in the way we do things here. I mean, for us, especially at Projector, it's about being here for the long term and that whole sustainability. You can either go hard, go fast, and you get shut down and you lose that platform, or you can tread that fine balance and try and work things, but become a trusted entity, which then, you know, there's this whole politics of engagement that you can have with government entities. So maybe full disclosure, I'm also part of Pink Dot, one of the organizing committee members. And from that activism point of view, we do understand, like, in the spectrum of activism, there's a whole range of ways you can do things. For us, from the start, it has always been about trying to engage the authorities, because we know the context in Singapore is that change doesn't come from, you know, certain ways. There are people who push those boundaries, and we actually do support them in different ways. And but for us, it's a lot of also backdoor diplomacy and engagement and all that in order to get, you know, certain policy changes happening. The same way with Projector, I mean, I'm not sure if many of you know, but till now, Chinese dialect films are banned from theatrical releases in Singapore because we had a Mandarin policy in the past. And it's a legacy, whereas on streaming platforms like Netflix and all, there are no restrictions on this. So theaters are actually penalized. Like all the Hong Kong films that you get to see for theatrical release tend to be Mandarin dubbed. And we've been trying to push that and engaging, but nobody wants to slaughter that. But for us, it's also, you pick your battles. You continue pushing, you try and they have this rule where if it's a festival, then you can do a Chinese dialect film. So what we do is then we find festivals like the Wong Kar Wai Festival or some other festival, and we try and program these films under them. So we work within this, but also make it very challenging for them to defend that policy, which may be outdated. And hopefully by pushing these boundaries, then, we do it. So I wouldn't say we're co-opted. I think we are constantly engaging the governments that be and pushing those OB markers or boundaries or whatever as we go along.
I think the two of you have really identified a useful way of thinking about activism as well, right? It doesn't have to be like outright challenging the government all the time. There's a time for that, but that doesn't have to be all the time, right? Yeah. Sorry, you wanted to say?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. Yeah.
Okay. So final question from me before we get audience participation. Is almost a full house. So another criticism of activists or people in independent spaces, right? We have our own language, or we use terminologies which people do not use sometimes. Like even just now in your very first answer, Prashant, you were saying what you were using words like unsafe, marginalized communities, whereas other people may find the term unsafe to mean completely something different, right? And also the way that you were using it comes from a very liberal, maybe woke-ish place, right? Even if you don't want to use the word, or what you get what I'm saying. And this can be sometimes distant from the people, right? So this is a question similar to the earlier one that is about activism in general or independent spaces in general, right? Are independent spaces, people who operate in independent spaces really distant from the ground, quote unquote?
Sure. I would say yes and no. I mean, yeah, it's definitely the space that we have doesn't cater to the masses the way you expect. I mean, people may relate more to like a Golden Village or something like that, and that's fine. Like, I mean, but where we try and work is with intermediaries to unlock spaces for people who need it, and to create that kind of dialogue. I mean, so an example for us is there's this whole punk community in Singapore who have no spaces to perform, largely because they don't run their own clubs and all that. So where we work with is actually with party promoters who bring in these punk gigs and all that, we allow them to find ways we find creative ways to make it viable for both us and for the punk community to run their gigs within our spaces. So while day to day we may not be speaking to this community in that sense, or they may not be hanging out in our space and all that, we do, if they do approach us and all that, we find ways to make it happen other than turning them away because they cannot afford that. And so going back to why there's always food and drinks involved with our spaces. I mean, when I started artistry, that was the first thing I was like, okay, we cannot create a space where there's no F&B because people will spend money on food and drinks, but they won't spend money on arts. So to me, it's always like you find ways to let people access these spaces, whether it's through something more familiar like a Thai milk tea, as opposed to like paying for a $10 gig kind of thing. But I mean, we recognize that it's not a void deck space, and then the people who use that space, and we a bit different, our price points are a bit different, higher, but it's the reality of a commercial space. And it's a balance that we strike, and a lot of our more atas kind of operations actually help to fund the more accessible kind of things that we do with different communities. So yeah, it's always about striking that balance. But we don't also speak for these people, like I mentioned. Like we just provide the space and we let them take over and see what happens.
Thank you.
I think when Karl Marx first came out with his thesis, nobody understood him except the intellectuals. But that thesis or those theories went on to affect probably half the world, right? So in the same way, I think what the people who are doing who are using independent spaces for discussion and so on, in the same way, what they're proposing is something new, it's different, it's bringing to awareness new ideas, which may be alien to most people, but at the same time, if it's not done, then there'll be no change, right? So it's not a defense of what is happening, but it is also a way to show that these people were informed by certain ideas, and they're trying to translate those ideas to the ground. Some do it more effectively, some are able to relate better, some less, right? That's all. But it's really a question of time before I think this happens. So you need time for the education to happen. But what's important is the platform, as Prashant said. It's the platform because I give you an example. Just 2-3 days ago, I think Workers Made Possible, a group of almost 100 organizations and individuals released 2 statements on the lorries, right? Would the migrant workers themselves have been able to do that? No, they wouldn't have been able to do that. Look at what happened to the guys who did the SMRT strike, the bus strike, right? So these are the ones who don't have a voice. So they need someone else to come out with a statement. And probably half the migrant workers don't understand, can't even read what the statement is all about. But they will enjoy. And if they knew what it was all about, they would definitely support it wholeheartedly, I'm sure. Yeah? So this is the situation. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. I mean, so just relating to that, actually, I think, it's quite important to also highlight, in a way, I mean, we are from a privileged position, like owning and running these spaces, not owning, but running these spaces. But it's important how we use that privilege also on that. So, I mean, the whole, migrant workers and the lorry thing is quite important in a way that we, like all these organizations, including Projector, came to put our privilege behind this policy and hopefully effect some change, because it's been going on for way too long, and they've always been deferring it. So I think there was a genuine interest among these communities to try and push for that change. Yeah.
Right. So there are multiple layers to the answer, right? So one is, yes, sometimes it starts off an elitist idea, but it spreads. Another one is the privileged must use their voices. And the third one is what you said earlier, which is there are multiple grounds, right? So I always, sometimes politicians, they want to dismiss your question, right? And it has happened to me a few times already, right? When you ask them something, then they'll say, oh, if you go to the ground, you'll know that what you're saying is not what you're talking about. I am on the ground. This is one ground. There are other grounds. There are multiple grounds in Singapore, right? You cannot just dismiss what I'm saying because you heard some other person. I am telling you these matters, right? Like simple thing. I'm going to go on a rant now. So I asked I asked this person, right, this MP, oh, there are no ATMs around here. Oh, no, now everybody uses PayNow, no? Now everybody is cashless. They say, oh, there are many elderly here. Oh, no. They say, what are you talking about? I am saying I have an elderly mother. I know what I'm talking about, and you're just dismissing it as, oh, if you go to the ground, I don't know what ground they are going to also, when they are on their first week. Anyway, so any questions from the floor or any comments? Oh, there's one. You tapped it instead of saying. So Sudhir has a question for both. How has the concept of independent space in Singapore changed since you first experienced a political awakening? Do you think it's easier or harder today to carve out these spaces? Okay, so maybe we need a timeline also, right? So would you say that since, okay, when you guys had a political awakening is not the same when I had a political awakening, right? So 2011, maybe, post 2011, and maybe in the past 3-4 years, do you see an expansion of the space since 2011, which was a watershed election? Or do you see expand, contract, expand, shrink, shrink? Which one do you see? Oh, yes. Please. But
I was actually assuming that, Hoe Fang would answer from a different time period and Prashant would answer from a different time period.
Okay, yeah. So
in terms of their respective...
So we can do that as well. So let's so we may do a deep dive into history.
I mean, I started back in 1979. Wow. Yeah, and in those days it was much easier because there was less surveillance, or the surveillance was not as sophisticated. They had to be physically on the ground to find out what was happening before they try and shut it down. So it was easier, and I had my own basement in those days, so it was easier, much easier. Today, I think today is much more difficult. And you can see they recognize the importance of these independent spaces. I mean, just say 2001, when the Workers' Party won a GRC, or one GRC, immediately HDB passed all the open spaces to the People's Association to manage. Because otherwise you'll be managed by the town council, right? So they recognize that. And so you can see that shrunk immediately the space, for alternative voices, yeah? And so it is a question of opening, closing. But I think the saving grace now is that there are a lot more young people who have not been clobbered yet. So they are braver, they are more open, and they have seen more of the world. So they say, what's wrong? You're using this space, right? So they are more open to it. But every now and then you will get clobbered. I don't have a good example because I think most of you know that, yeah. But you want an example, kind of see me afterwards, yeah.
Yeah, I think for me I will go with the open close in a way that it's very hard for us to be quite clear where the boundaries are. Sometimes we think certain things will pass and it doesn't. And sometimes we were like, there's no way this will pass, and we submit it and it's like, oh, it gets cleared. So it's this whole murky waters of, and I'm talking about in the context of censorship for the content that we show. It's sometimes very hard because the code is very loosely worded. If you're talking about LGBT stuff, you cannot forget the exact words, but it's like you cannot have positive portrayal of this as a lifestyle and all that. So then it becomes, but then a lot of stuff somehow gets allowed, which we are quite surprised to. So it's always this, you submit and then you wait, see what happens, and then you appeal and all this. So it's this constant engagement, which actually for a business can be quite frustrating because there's always a time lag. Things may be, by the time it gets clear. We had we had a film that was quite sensitive because it featured a regional politician and talking about corruption and stuff. So even though we thought it would have cleared easily, but because of political sensitivities within government to government, it was delayed for a long time before it got cleared. And this has commercial impact for entities like us. So it's sometimes quite frustrating for us to figure out what our programming is, because by the time it gets delayed, then we have to figure out ways to plug it, and that affects your revenue streams and your bottom lines. So they're very real bread and butter issues for a commercial entity like us. And the frustrating part of it is it's all very ambiguous, and till now, we don't have clear guidelines on what's allowed and what's not allowed. because they're all loosely worded, which, fair enough, it gives them the flexibility also to then allow things to pass for us. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, so we have a question from the floor. So,
about number what kind of values because I extensions so this button with your phones to add a sheet and come such a data on that.
sorry, maybe I'll go over there. Yeah. So I'll go over there. Yeah. You want to come in?
Okay, actually I was wondering what kind of boundaries this kind of censorship and asking will it pass or not might produce in your heads, just preventing you from handing something in at all. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Okay.
I got the question. So what's the process of self-censorship like? How do you decide when to submit, when not to submit, right? That's the question?
Yeah, so there are costs to submitting a film for censorship. For every 30 minutes, it's $82. So if it's a 2-hour film, it's a $320 cost in order to submit it. And for example, so then if it gets censored or edited, we won't be able to show it, but we still have to pay that. So there are certain costs that as a commercial entity, we need to bear. So for us, we are also mindful, can we, if we're limited to one screen, we've made this mistake before as a learning, it was a Renhang documentary, which we had paid for the license for 3 screenings. But then in the end, IMDA was like, oh, you can only do 1 screening. And so, we couldn't get our money back. We couldn't make money from it. So, it was a loss-making thing. So for us, as much as we would like to submit everything and see what comes back and in terms of what's allowed or not. But unfortunately, we need to make commercial decisions to see whether what's the risk of it being edited. And as a policy, Projector doesn't screen films that require cuts, just to honor the director's wish. So this is the kind of balance that we tread. But sometimes we really want to, we're not sure, we just try and push it and find out, but we absorb the cost of that censorship in that sense, if it requires any cuts. Was that the question you?
I didn't know that. And what is? Yeah, this was new to me. I was a little bit more thinking about if there's a censorship out there, you will just make boundaries in your head, just thinking far enough. That would be my suggestion, but I'm not sure. I would like to hear your take on it.
So self-censorship as opposed to actual censorship, because you are anticipating the boundaries. And what happens is you draw the boundaries nearer in.
Yeah, I think for us, when in doubt, we try and submit it and let them make the decision. For us, it's usually more a commercial decision rather than, because usually if we come to the point where we want to submit it, it's very spicy kind of content that we want to screen. So we do think there's value in it, but it's just whether we can make it commercially viable. So in that sense, we don't necessarily practice self-censorship. It's only if we think that it's not going to be commercially viable, then we find ways to either negotiate license fees or figure ways to make it happen, even as a single screening. Because there are different ways of paying for licenses in Singapore.
I'm into books, so not films. I dare say that in all these years, I've never self-censored any book except one. And this one was a self-censor. It was a book of political cartoons by the late Morgan Chua. Morgan Chua was a Singaporean who did fantastic political cartoons. He was employed, he had to leave Singapore because his cartoons didn't find favor in the official eyes, and he left Singapore and went to work for the Far Eastern Economic Review, right? So, and then of course, Far East Economic Review collapsed, or rather closed down, and he returned to Singapore. I commissioned him to do a series of cartoons. And at the point of time, those cartoons are all, I mean, I had no issue with them, yeah? But the particular cartoon for the cover was something that I knew would get us into trouble. And not just trouble, it would bring the weight of everything onto us. This is the plot for the book, right? When it comes out, yeah. So this was 2 years ago. 2 years ago. And that book has been kept in cold storage because I did not, I felt that it would be too dangerous for us to come out with a particular book at that point of time. 2 years has passed. And it's still dangerous, but less so. And it will be coming out. So, we're ready to buy it.
And everyone here will get a free copy.
Yeah, that does. There guys, whoever comes, put a special discount.
Okay, so you heard it as well. Now, you cannot let us go on that. You have to tell us what exactly caused you to self-censor that. What exactly was the decision, and what changed in these 2 years? Do you think the space has expanded in these 2 years, or?
I think emotions have died down.
Okay, yeah. So we know what he's talking about. All right. Yeah. Okay, so let's get that. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you for the sharing. This is very interesting. I think I have a question more relating to the relationship between communities and space. So how should spaces be like after communities use them? So to what extent do you draw the line in which after communities influence a space, that you still remain independent? Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I'm not sure I get it. So when communities use spaces, they become not independent? That's what you're saying?
Because I have to think that like when communities kind of use a space, they kind of imbue a space with their own qualities and like their quirks,
right.
Their arts and stuff.
Right,
yeah.
okay. Thank you. Yeah.
To me.
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but let me try and then tackle it. I mean, for us, we have different communities occupying that space, but I think the general values that we imbue within for Projector is like you embrace diversity. So when you come in, you get exposed to stuff that you may not be expecting in a way. And then same thing, that literally days where, because we have 3 halls at Golden Mile Tower, there could be a punk gig in Blue Room, there'll be a queer party in Red Room, and there could be a church renting something in the Green Room. And we've had that, and they all end up in the communal space in the foyer, which is by design. It's something that we've done before, because we want communities to mix, interact, and be exposed to different kind of elements in Singapore. And then that piques a bit of curiosity. But also we attract a certain kind of people to our space in a way. So it's almost self-selecting in a way. So I think everyone ends up being richer from that experience of interacting with different communities. And yeah, I mean, it's always been interesting. Everyone seems to be able to find their safe space within that generic space, if that makes sense. But I think it's also because of the staff that we have who make that space a bit more comfortable, and you can show up in whatever you're comfortable in and not be judged and all that. So it's a lot of that kind of, it's a bit hard to pinpoint, but it's a vibe, I guess.
Very Gen Z of you. It's a vibe.
Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with Prashant. You just have to embrace diversity, regardless of your individual stand on issues, and communities will begin to recognize it. It's when you focus too much on one particular community, then there will be that lashback, or rather that kickback. What do you call that? Backlash. Yeah. Right? So I think just embrace diversity. Yeah.
Okay. There are a couple of questions. One is from Sudhir. So it's for me. Do I consider Teh Tarik with Walid an independent space? I do. do you feel that it offers a sense of escape away from your day job? My day job is not that bad, and so far it's pretty independent so far. If I could answer, being independent doesn't mean that there is no self-censorship. I would lie to myself if I do not self-censor, and I do. I think I probably self-censor less than many or most Singaporeans, but definitely there is a degree of self-censorship. And also, you know, humanity has always functioned on the premise that nobody says everything they think, right? Cameras, there will be no friendships. So some degree of self-censorship, I think in that sense, is normal, is expected. But what we're talking about is of a political angle, right? If I say this, then something will happen. But I won't lie, I definitely engage in that, even while I think it's independent. From Corey, do you think independent spaces are always expected to be activist spaces in Singapore? So do independent spaces, right? Because if independent spaces, then, but they are very pro-government, right? Right, naturally, there's no government patronage, but they only give talks like pro-government support. But nobody will consider that independent anymore, right? Is that fair?
I think for us, we are an entertainment space. So I think that's, I mean, constantly when I need to remind our staff also that we, you know, ultimately are here to provide entertainment and then make it accessible for the soft power of advocacy and activism and all, and then push boundaries through that way. But if you stop having fun, then I think people, you know, get less interested in it. So yeah, I think for us, I don't really see ourselves as an activist organization. We are an independent organization, but ultimately we do things to have fun and then use that to create space for other people who, you know, need this kind of space. Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be activist.
No, I don't think we can be pigeonholed.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Prashant. I'm always agreeing with you. You see what happened is, it seems activist because actually it's the other way around. The POP or the government will never come and use your space.
Yeah.
Because there's so much space elsewhere. Let's see, yeah? But if they will come and use the space, or apply to use the space that we have, I will be open to it. I have no going to censor just because I disagree with views. I will be open to it, yeah? But we just have to pay a bit more because they can afford it, yeah? So, I'm a socialist, right? So if we can afford more, you pay better. When something like this, can pay less, yeah? Simple as that, yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I would be happy to have all next 10 episodes with PAP members. Honestly, if they agree, I'll be happy to have next 10, next 20 episodes. It's just that I haven't gotten many yeses with. Okay, so there is a question. It's a bit of a downer, to be honest, but it's a necessary one. What do we do? Where do we go when or if the projector is gone? Hopefully not. When all these rich people are gone or silenced by the harsh reality of censorship, and real estate consumes us, where do all these voices go? I guess that's a perennial worry also, right? Of people who operate in independent spaces, that practical realities. I think Mr. Fong is an outstanding example, but he's an anomaly, right? Most people who reach his age would not be like him. They would be much safer. They wouldn't be socialists, right? When they are younger, they'll be socialists. When they are richer, they become fiscal conservatives, right? So that's the norm. Not only in Singapore, throughout the world, surveys have borne this out, right? So that is a perennial worry, right? When people become, or even the earlier word you used, which is true. I'm not saying that it's not true, but the more people start picking their battles, they start telling themselves, right, that, oh, actually, right, I'm doing this for the greater good. And they compromise and compromise and compromise until that greater good doesn't come, and they are transformed by the process of thinking that I'm doing this for the greater good, right? So all these are perennial worries of activists and independent spaces. So what do you do?
No, I think for me, well, the real estate part, which I will address first, is a genuine concern. I mean, Golden Mile Tower, where we are at, is constantly on block or on the market, and we'd never know the moment itself. We lose the space in about 2 years, and it's not easy to move a cinema. You can move a shop quite easily to other locations, but because of the way cinemas are scaled, it's not so easy to move and find replacement spaces in Singapore. So that's been constantly on our minds in terms of being sustainable in the long term. But for us, we find ways to adapt. We've done a couple of projects recently. We took over abandoned clubs. We took over disused cinemas, even though it's temporary, but we worked out very good deals with the landlords so that it will make sense for us to occupy these spaces for 18 months or a year. So we've always adapted. I mean, I'm quite lucky to have a team passionate about it, and they are willing to. It's exhausting, and let's not discount the labor of running an independent space. It's really a struggle, but yet everyone kind of enjoys that kind of kampung spirit, and the moment people come and gather and they have fun, you get re-energized also. So we also feed off this energy from our community. So I think that's, I think one thing that we've learned, particularly since COVID happened also, is to not, or be ready to adapt to different situations. And then an example would be most recently, I mean, we were eyeing Cine Leisure, which is in Orchard. And just to put some context, for Projector to exist, we screen a lot of films that are kind of controversial and therefore gets R21 ratings. And R21 can only exist in the city area because, you cannot influence the heartlands. So I mean, also this is not clearly in policy, but it's something that we understand to be, and I wish to be proven wrong. So, I mean, that's one thing. So the only spaces we can unlock tend to be spaces in the city, which then tend to be more expensive. But, Orchard Cine Leisure was an example where we wanted to unlock it, but it's huge and it's expensive. And there's no way that we can occupy the whole space. So we did an unconventional approach where we actually approached Golden Village to see if they were willing to co-share the space, meaning that we take 3 halls, they take 3 halls, and we run. And it's never been done before. We don't know how it's going to happen, but it's going to open in December this year. So yeah, I mean, for us, it was about not being so stubborn in the way we think of how things need to be, and try and adapt and figure out ways, because there's also that sort of en bloc hanging over us at Golden Mile. So I think to summarize, we'll find ways to survive. It may not be exactly what you get in Golden Mile. It may be in a soulless mall, but we will create and adapt a space that everyone can feel comfortable in. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. Great, man, Prashant. Yeah. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. And this was about okay. How do we carry on when the what is gone? We need to find a capitalist who was a socialist at heart, and revive that in him. I will tell you what happened. I was in Chicago about 7, 8 years ago. I stumbled across this building called the Poetry Foundation. It was a huge, magnificent building that reached up to like 12, 14 stories high. And the Poetry Foundation, who buys poetry? Right? How did this come about? So I investigated, and I found out a capitalist with a socialist heart donated 200 million to the Poetry Foundation. Right? And guess what? All her manuscripts, she loved poetry, all her poetry manuscripts have been rejected before. You know? So if you think that she did this because of poetry, because she had been published by these guys, support them? No, it's not true. She did it because she really believed in the art, and she had the means. Do we have such people in Singapore? We actually have, but they are afraid. Because when they do this, and they buy a cinema for you, they are afraid of what will happen to them. The rest of the world will be gone. And that is actually what is keeping it safe.
Thank you. So just now, I wanted to pick up on the point, the R21 thing. You said it's not policy, but it's understood by people who operate in the space. So and you say you would like to be proven wrong. So if you are wrong, this episode will get a POF mark, right? And if not, that means you're right. And then I'm hoping for it. I'm just saying that's how we falsify the...
Yeah, maybe I can give a little bit context to that. I think when the R21 ratings were first passed, actually it went out to the heartlands. Cinemas in the heartlands were allowed to run R21 movies as well. But I think somebody complained. And that somebody is probably an influencer. Even in those days without social media, you can be an influencer. And so the policy remained as such. It's the same as the Mandarin and the dialect thing, Actually, I think the government today is quite happy to let it go. But because no civil servant dare to put it up, because of they don't want to lose their job, right? If they're broke, don't fix it, right? So it carries on, right? So we have to push. The civil servants have to regain their spirit of being servants. Yeah.
Thank you. Any final questions or final couple of questions or comments? Yes, Arun. Oh, okay. We go Arun first, then Debbie.
Yes. So I keep hearing the notion of how the precarity of these spaces seem to be forcing possibly you to innovate the way you stay sustainable or stay relevant or stay, for lack of a better term, edgy. So would stability then rob you of that? Rob these spaces of that pushing the boundaries sort of thing that you have? Yes.
That's an excellent question. So the moment the PAP opens up,
No,
these spaces will not be AJ anymore.
No, that's the thing, yeah. So I think it applies to all commercial entities. It's not just, independent art spaces. Every business that needs to generate revenue needs to be always on the forefront of innovation and trying. And if you don't, then, you just don't exist anymore. And that's the way the free market kind of operates. So for us, we are also forced to be always innovating because we know this is the reality of the landscape. I don't think we'll ever be in a stable state at any point. We've gotten comfortable in that space of instability and always constant change. In fact, by the time we settle Cine Leisure, we'll always be looking for the next step on what that is going to be and what, these are the spaces, whether we can unlock heartland spaces and all that. So I think as a business and as an independent space, we're always in a state of flux.
But I guess the question is, if Singapore democratizes, if the PAP democratizes, will your entity cease to be relevant?
I think there's always somebody who needs space. Even if PAP democratizes, people will need space. There's always somebody at the bottom rung of that ladder who needs space. So, and we are there for them,
Yeah. I think Well, democratization is one thing. It's going to take some time to happen. Maybe your grandchild will get to see it. I don't know. Yeah, but yeah, it will probably happen. But it will take some time, right? Secondly, is that we need to protect the existing spaces, independent spaces that we have, so that these do not disappear. And I'm talking about Projector, of course, a space like that. Yeah, go but see more films. Go and support them more often. Yeah? But there's one space, Hong Lim Park, which is really quite independent. Of course, you still have to apply for licenses and so on. But nobody seems to want to use that because it's associated with rebels, associated with all those guys who are against the government, all those, So people are frightened. And they don't help it by putting cameras all over the place, right? So I would say, guys, don't be afraid. Go for it. Support whatever causes that you can see there. Protect that space. That was achieved, that space was achieved by, from my perspective, achieved by Dr. Chi Soon Juan, who really pushed for it until Lee Kuan Yew, in his interview with some journalists in America, promised or said, we will make the space, And so Hong Lim Park was born. Yeah. And so let's value it. Let's not avoid it. Yeah.
Okay, final. Oh, okay, so we can take both. Then we first, then we'll take both at the same time.
Thank you. Actually, my question is related to what you just said about fear. So, how do we make it more palatable for like mainstream audiences to be receptive to like alternative viewpoints in your experience? How do we introduce like not new but alternative views of social justice issues, especially to these audiences?
So how do we avoid reaching to the crowd, right?
Thanks for the sharing and the allegories. So I guess what I have in mind is like, maybe it's a question for you. Is the idea of like, is the substation like ever like hanging thought back in your mind? Because a more pointed question would be like, do you see yourself as like a spiritual successor to the substation?
Okay, so two questions. How do we make these ideas more palatable to the mainstream? Because, I mean, let's face it, everyone here probably agrees with whatever you have said. Everyone watching online also, right? So how do you avoid preaching to the choir, to the congregation? And then the other one, do you see yourself as a spiritual successor to the substation?
I think how to avoid preaching to the choir, for us, it's always about how we create that cross-pollination in a way from events, entertainment, activism, and all this. And a lot of this happens in this communal space that we call intermission bar or the foyer space. Often enough, we actually do have exhibitions and all in this space. So people who may come to watch some fluff kind of movie get exposed to these, issues and all that, which otherwise they may not be exposed to. So that's one thing. I mean, the other thing is also for us, just in terms of, we often like complimentary listing of events like, Freedom Film Festival and all that, which may not be our events, but we actually list it in our website. So people going to watch some other film may be exposed to this and therefore may be interested to then catch it. I mean, these are quite simple ways that we do, but for us, it's like, at least if it helps one or two people be exposed to this kind of thing and know that these things exist. Because a lot of times organizations do their things, but it's very hard to do the outreach. But for us, we have a very broad kind of outreach, which spans all kinds of demographics and particularly in a more lifestyle entertainment kind of thing. So it becomes a bit more palatable. It's not so scary in a way, and it's not, like you say, I mean, actually people do find going to Hong Lim Park a bit more, there's a sense of fear, but going to Projector to listen to a talk and all is not so fearful in a way. So I think that's how we try and create that kind of environment.
Mr. Fong, final word?
Yeah. I I think fear is something that's very real, especially and ideas. We've always been bombarded whether by the media or by the powers that be, that it's dangerous to have alternative ideas. It's wrong if you do not follow the official narrative. But it will come, because the younger people, I mean, I gotta give them credit, they are getting more and more, well, I mean, they have the ideas, they know what is right and what is wrong, their feelings for truth, their feelings for what is, for this kind of thing is very much stronger. I'll give you an example. In the early days when when the Workers' Party was going around trying to raise funds, collecting funds, people would always slide it up to them, have some money in an envelope, and say, take this, cover the face and move away. Seriously. But today is a bit different. There are people who are PayPal, right? You use PayPal, and they do it, right? Don't forget, I think Mr. Low and Sylvia Lim, they raised almost $1 million in 2 days using PayPal, bank accounts, and so on, because people were so angry at the injustice being done to them. I mean, at least those guys who donated that, yeah? So, I think the young people are getting braver and braver, and the fear is dying off. But it will take time, yeah? It will take time.
I think on that hopeful note, please join me in thanking our guest today. It was an excellent episode. So you can catch it on Instagram Live, and Kok Go is here as well. We did the first annual live Teh Tarik with Walid last week, and that's also available on YouTube and on Instagram. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being here.